In a previous project over here on the right, I had my navigation set with these ovals, and you can see that I have a hover. If I click on my first chapter, I get a background color and a tilt. And as I go through all my different chapters, I get a different background color, but they all have the same tilt. Well, I was kind of curious, how could I get the functionality of a tilt, but only to show up for the one particular chapter that I'm on, and have everything else go back to the default. So for instance, if I was looking at chapter 2, I would want only chapter 2 to be colorized and tilted, and everything else to be in these default regular gray plain styles. And so that's where I came across this particular snippet of code that I'm going to show you, just in case you want to use it for your navigation as well. So I'm going to close out of here, and this is how this one works. You have a tilt. You don't necessarily need a tilt, but I'm just using it to take advantage of a new piece of code that I learned, and I think it's kind of funny looking. But when I hit button 2, or for chapter 2, whatever, only that one is showing the tilt and the darker gray. And no matter which one I click, it makes the previous clicks back to the default value. And that's what I was looking for. Now I have a couple of different things that I'm going to be showing you in this tutorial. One is how we can have just one thing fire off a certain style at a time. And then another thing is down here, this click me button. I'm going to attach an event listener to the button, and the event listener is going to call 4 totally different functions. So by one single click of the button, I can have 4 different things happen. This is a single element that I'm attaching an event listener to with multiple functions. But up here, this is like an array of items, because each of these divs that look like a button, they're just styled to look like a button. This is a real button. These are divs that just have a style called my button. But this is how you would get a whole group, give an event listener to a whole group. And because this is a whole group, an array would have to use a for loop to iterate through each one of these individual items. So this has got a little bit of complication in this part of the code, and this has a little bit of complication, but not so much by giving it event listeners and letting that event listener pop off 4 different functions, but the fact that I also have attached to the button itself an on-click event that does a totally different function that's going to toggle this click me button from red to green. It's going to change the words on the face of the button, and so when I show you the beginning part of the code, I'm going to misspell the toggle function so that we can just focus on the 4 functions that the event listeners are going to fire off. And then toward the end of the video, I will spell it correctly so you can see what that toggle function does. And I'll misspell the 4 functions that the event handlers fire off. And then at the very end, I'll make sure that everything is running, and I'll fire this off, and you'll see it's kind of crazy looking because so many different things are happening. You won't realize what functions are doing what, but that's why I'm going to misspell a few parts of the code just so you can see certain parts at a time. Okay, that was longer than the introduction needed to be, but let's get on it. I've got a folder here, and it's called awesomeonly1.html. Every time I research a particular thing that I want in code, until I get it working to the way I need it to be, I will just name it something random. But once I get it working and that's exactly what I was looking for, I tack a big fat capitalized awesome on the front of it because I've got so many files on this laptop, and that's my little way of differentiating what's working for me. What gave me the success I was looking for, basically. So let me right click awesomeonly1.html. You can name it whatever you want, index or only one or whatever. And the only other thing that's in this folder with this HTML web page is an MP3 file. And I named it a silly la.mp3 because I don't really care about what it is. I just want to show you how it works in code so you could use it for your own purposes. Alright, so I'm going to move this over here, right click, and have them side by side. Best thing for me to do is start at the top and work my way down. Opening HTML tag, opening head tag. There's a meta char set equals UTF-8. Title, hello, hello. And in our style tags, it starts on line 6 and ends on line 30. I gave the body a background color of silver. There's a class named selected that has background of gray, border of thick silver outset, padding of 5 pixels. Transform is set, let me open this up a little more because this looks like it's on 2 lines, but this is actually 1 line of code. Transform, translate, in parentheses, -25%, comma 10%, and then a space, rotate, -20 degrees. That's all on the same line, and that is what you see right here. When you click on one of these, that's what happens to it. That's the style that causes that. Then there's the style, my button. Width is 100 pixels, border is thick white outset, and padding is 5 pixels. That is for these styles. This is the default style. Also notice that in the default style, the text align where it says button 4, button 5, button 6, they're all being justified to the left. Well, once we kick it over to the selected style, we also move the text to align to the right. You may or may not have noticed that, but you know, it's very, very slight changes in the style. Now when I get to the closer to the end of the video, when I go to the toggle function for this click me on click event for the click me button, these are the 2 styles it's going to toggle. The on class has a background color of green, color of white, width of 100 pixels, and border of 10 pixels, green outset. And then the off class has a background set to red, a color set to white, a width set to 100 pixels, and a border of 10 pixels, red outset. Alright, so there's the end of our CSS. So let me close up the style tags. And now let's look at the JavaScript. Our opening script tag starts on line 32, and that takes us all the way to wish I would have taken these off before I got to recording. All the way to line 96. So it's really not too bad, especially since we've got some spaces and stuff here. Alright, the first line that we have here is we're starting a function called add listeners. You could call it add event listeners. In this case, they're just called add listeners. Function add listeners, empty parentheses, and opening curly brace. Everything in green that you see here is a comment. So this comment goes for this statement. We're going to check our browser's ability to use the add event listener, to add an event listener actually. So we have this statement, if window.addEventListener, curly brace. Then we want to target just one element and give it an event listener. Now we're talking about this click me element down here, this button. So we have, I should probably separate the individual statements to make it a little easier to grasp. we have four different statements here that are going to add event listeners to this single click me button, and for each event listener we are going to call a different function. So there's a lot of repetition here. All of these statements start with this part: document.getElementById, parentheses and quotes, my button 1, dot add event listener, and the only thing that's different, well, really not even this whole thing is different. We're all of these event listeners are going to listen for that button to be clicked. So click, 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 click. But what's different is the name of the function that it's calling. So for the first one, it's going to call the myMessage function, and then you've got a third parameter here that says false. And I'm not sure how to explain what that means, but you can Google it if you want to know what that false stands for. I know there's true, false, and there's a few other options that you can use, and I don't know when they're indicated. The next statement to add yet another event listener to open another function for this button is document.getElementById, my button 1 dot add event listener, and in parentheses click, comma your message, comma false. So this is going to fire off the your message function. Here's the third one. Again, we're dealing with this button. Document.getElementById, parentheses and quotes, my button 1 dot add event listener, in parentheses click, comma new background color, comma false. So here is the third function. It's going to be called new background color. And lastly, we have document.getElementById, parentheses and quotes, my button 1 dot add event listener, click, sing, false. So the fourth function that gets called when you click this button is called sing. Basically what this one does is you're going to get an alert box that says something. Here's another alert box that says something. This function is going to change the background color from this silver color to a tan, and then this sing function is going to play an MP3 file. So really that's all that's going to happen. So all of that is dealing with this little button. And this button has the ID set to my button 1. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to loop through all of our target elements. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped a spot. Here, now we're going to deal with these things up here. We're going to target all of the elements that you want event listeners for and put that into a variable. So on the right hand side we have document.querySelector all, and in parentheses and quotes we have a class dot my dash button. So our class is my button. Each of these are going to have that class attached to it. That's how they're styled all the same in the beginning with those default styles. And we're going to be able to utilize the changes by changing the class. We're going to loop through all of these targeted elements for, oh, I'm sorry, I don't think I finished this. On the right hand side we've got document.querySelector all, class my button, and then with this equals we are assigning that to this variable called my buttons. So everywhere you see that my buttons are highlighted here in green, you're using that variable in different statements to achieve what we're trying to do here. Var my buttons equals document.querySelector all, parentheses and quotes, class my button. Now on 53 we're gonna loop through all of these targeted elements. So we've targeted them all, but we need to loop through all of them. So we're going to use a for loop. This is the outer for loop. Down here on line 62 we have an inner for loop. You have to have both of these in order to make sure that every single thing you click doesn't look like button 3. Only one at a time will look like button 3. For var I equals 0, as long as I is less than my buttons dot length, we're going to increment I, opening curly brace. The next statement here, we're going to create a variable to stand for each individual element. We're talking about a group of elements here, but we want to be able to use a variable as if we're only using one at a time. So we have var button equals my buttons index I. My buttons index I. My buttons is this array of we're going to call them buttons even though they're divs, and the I stands for the iterator, which is going to change with each loop. It starts off at 0, then it's going to go through the loop, and then it'll be 1, 2, so on and so forth. So this is going to do that for us. Button is going to be representing each individual item in this array. Next, we're going to bind the click event to call this function. So button.addEventListener, in parentheses we've got click in quotes, comma, and instead of the name of the function like we did for the click me here when we added 4 different click event listeners, we are going to create our function right here. So we have the function header, function in parentheses event, and then an opening curly brace. Now we're going to need that inner loop to loop through each element and remove the CSS style class from all elements so that it's only going to show the CSS style class on the most current element clicked instead of all the elements that have been clicked. So that's where this for loop comes in handy. And this is the same for loop header as we used before. For var I equals 0, I less than my buttons dot length, I plus plus, opening curly brace. Line 64, we're going to create a new variable for the elements to use when removing the class. Before we created var button equals my buttons index I, now we're going to create var button 2 equals my buttons index I. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the class with this statement, button2.classList.remove, and then in parentheses and quotes, selected. The name of the class is selected. We're removing it with this single statement right here. You close your inner loops curly brace right here at line 67, and outside of the inner for loop that we finished, we have this line that says this .classList.toggle, and then in parentheses and quotes we've got that class selected again. We're going to toggle back and forth from all of these different clickings. We're going to toggle it on and off. Now with that being done, we have our end of the event listener. So in line 71 we have our closing curly brace, our closing parenthesis, and our ending semicolon right there. And you see that that's red. If I move on up, you'll see the beginning of the event listener will be in red as well. See, button.addEventListener, right there it's red. And this one is the end of the outer for loop, line 72. Now that I have it highlighted, if I move up, you'll see the beginning of the for loop. Right here. There's the header for the beginning of that outer for loop. And this, on line 73, is the closing of the end if, the if condition. So let's look where that started. It should be the header to the if condition. If, and it is, if window.addEventListener. So we've got all of our curly braces paired up properly. Here, add your functions. These are the 4 functions that when we first started, we created event listeners for this button right here, and those 4 event listeners were targeting 4 different functions. These are the functions that we're targeting. They're super short and simple. Function my message. In the block it says alert this message. This is my message to you. Then there's function your message, which in the block it's an alert that says this is your message to me. The third function new background color, which in the block it just says document.body.style.background color equals tan. So this whole background will no longer be this silver gray color, it'll be more of a tan. And then finally, function sing, and in the block we have var audio equals new audio, and in parentheses la la la.mp3. This is the first statement. There's 2 statements in this one. And then we have a single shorty called audio.play. Now if you have more than one MP3 that different elements are going to fire off on your page, you want to give each audio a different name. If you had 3 audios that you wanted to play based on different events, you would have var audio 1 equals new audio, la 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 mp3, and then audio 1 play. And then wherever else in your function or wherever else in your page, you might have another one, and you just give it something simple, audio 2, and then audio 2 play. And so on and so forth. So that's the fourth function. Here's the ending of the entire function add listeners. So on line 91, there's the ending. Let's double check that this is correct by going up and making sure that we see the opening for the function add listeners, highlighted in red. There it is, right here, function add listeners. Good to go. Okay. After the function add listeners, we have, right before the end of the closing script tag, we have a single statement that says window.onload equals add listeners. Well, we just finished up the whole function add listeners. This just makes sure when you first open your web page, when the window is loading, it calls the add listeners function right off. Function is nothing more than a recipe. You have to do something to execute it, and you have to call it. So this is how we call it. So now we're done with the JavaScript. So now I can close the whole head up. I'll go up here, let's close it and get it out of the way. Now we're just going to look at the body. And there's not a whole lot going on in the body. See right here, and we're done. All of these divs are fake buttons up here. Div ID equals B1, class equals my button. The face of the button says button 1, and then the ending div tag. And you just copy and paste those until you get however many buttons you want to play with. In this case, we have 6 buttons. Which, whatever happened to 6? That's weird. Like, I went from B5 to B7. Okay, that was weird. And then here's an HR tag, which is just a horizontal roll. It gives us this pencil thin line right here. And this little piece is our button down here. Input type equals button, ID equals my button 1, value equals click me, and on click equals toggle state parentheses this. This function is the last thing that we'll talk about in this video. That's this function down here underneath everything, from line 110 to line 125. These are the script tags right before the ending of the body. This is what's going to toggle this button and change colors. Each time you click it, it's going to use a different part of the function. But it's misspelled, so it's not going to execute. That's like taking this and commenting it all out temporarily. We'll show you this in a second. Okay, it's refreshed. You see, our nested for loops are doing the job for this. Now let's hit our click me button and see those 4 functions fire off that we created with our 4 event listeners. This is my message to you. This is your message to me. La, 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 la. And that's kind of corny, but that was both the last 2 functions, one that's playing an MP3 file and the other that's changing the background color to tan. Alright, so you see the functionality of all of that. Now let me show you the function toggle state, and let me temporarily comment out those 4 functions that we just watched happen right here. The function my message, your message, new background color, and sing. We're going to temporarily comment them out so they don't execute, because I only want you to understand one thing at a time. On my button, I have an on-click event set to toggle state parentheses this. This is a function that's as long as this is spelled correctly, that's going to fire when you click this. So it starts off with function toggle state parentheses x opening curly brace, and it has an if condition. Now if this condition is true, then it will execute what's in these curly braces, which is these 4 lines. If this is not true, it will ignore all of that and it will jump straight down here to the else, and it will do what's in these curly braces, which is these 4 lines. Now, this click me button is not set to any style right now. Let's look at the click me button again. See right here? Input type equals button ID equals my button 1, value equals click me. It doesn't say class equals. There's no class attached to this. I can look and see if my button 1 has anything special going on in the style, but I don't believe. Body selected, my button on and off. No, I don't even have pound my button 1 up there in the style. So it is a styleless button, as you can see right now. And I'm almost done here. So what's going to happen is this first statement is false. X.className equals on. That's not true. So this gets ignored. We go straight to the else, and we will do these things. We will see an alert, which is a pop-up that says we got to pay it. Then x.className equals on. We will turn the class on this button. Then we will also change the face of the button. It will go from saying click me to saying paid. And lastly, x.style.transform equals rotate 10 degrees. So we're going to do these things first. x.className equals, x.value equals, x.style.transform equals. So let's click it and see what we got. Okay. I didn't refresh the page first, so it's still pulling. It's still pulling up those 4 functions that that we had set earlier. But now that I've refreshed the page and I click this, that shouldn't happen again. This should happen. We got to pay it. We got to pay it. Paid. X.className equals on. So it gave us the class, the styles. X.value equals paid. You can see paid. X.style.transform equals rotate negative 10 degrees. It went counterclockwise. Negative 10 degrees of rotation. Now, when we click it again, it's going to call this function again. And it's going to go straight to the top like a waterfall. And it's going to ask this if condition. If x.className equals on. Well, right now it is on because we turned it on. So this will be true. Now this will be true, which means everything in these curly braces is going to run this time. We're going to see alert, yay, it's paid. Then we're going to see x.className equals off. Then we're going to change the class from on to off, so it's going to be red. X.value equals not paid, so the text on the button will go from paid to not paid. And then x.style.transform equals rotate 10 degrees. Now, instead of doing a counterclockwise rotation, it's going to do a 10 degrees of clockwise rotation. So instead of it being tilted this way, it's going to be tilted this way. So let's click it. Yay, it's paid. Not paid. Red background. Different rotation. Now, if I click it again, if I click it again, it's going to start at the top of the function because it's calling it, it's firing it off again. It's going to ask this question. If x.className equals on, it's not. So you can see we've got our toggle here. It's just going to keep toggling back and forth. Now, things like this are fun when you're getting into animation. You could make some really goofy looking pages. But this is annoying with all these alert boxes, but this was just being done to show you an example of how this stuff works. Okay, so now our toggle state is spelled correctly, and you've seen how that worked with that button. You already seen how the event listeners let that button call 4 different functions, but I commented it out so that we wouldn't get confused. Now I have uncommented the 4 functions, and I have the on-click event also spelled correctly. So now when we run this, it's going to be kind of like crazy. We got to pay it. Paid. This is my message to you. This is your message to me. La 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 la. Yay, it's paid. This is my message to you. Not paid. This is your message to me. Okay, not paid. We gotta pay it. So see, it's insane. In order for me to show you the multiple ways that I had a few different types of code that you might want to fiddle with, I had to comment stuff out. And this is kind of what it's like when you're learning how to code. You get an idea of something that you want to address, and in order to not become too confused when you incorporate a new section of your code in your program, you have to comment stuff out or misspell stuff so that everything isn't running at the same time. You want to be able to focus on a little piece of your code at the same time. All right, you guys have a great night. I'm out of here.